Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another exciting class as we continue with the Book of Enoch. I'm actually going to go a little bit backwards in this class because I want to take a closer look at some things in the astronomical book which are interesting. And I also want to address some questions that came up in the last class. Now, Susan just wrote a question in terms of our last class, which is, she said, why in the Second Temple period was there this greater interest in angels, the nature of heaven, and the idea of judgment day to settle reward and punishment? Well, one of the theories is that this had to do with the Persian period, that part of the effect of Persian thought was that Jews thought more about what's going on in heaven. Like there was always an acknowledgement of angels, but there wasn't a real interest in, what are their names, what exactly are their jobs. Like, okay, they're angels and they come, they do stuff for God. They're messengers. Like we literally use the word for messenger for angel. Actually, it's interesting, just as an aside. So we use the word malach, angel, and also the same word we use for a messenger. In Akkadian, this is actually a verb to send. Il-ik is like, you can actually, it's actually the same root, like a lot, kind of the lamed aleph kaf is the root of this verb to send, right? So we don't have the verb, we just have the noun, but that's what an angel is, a messenger. And that's enough, right, for most of the biblical period until we get to the Second Temple period. And then once we get into that period, and in books like, and even in a biblical book like Daniel, which is later, they're all of a sudden, so angels, there's like, oh, angels can be named. Angels have specific jobs. So it's very possible that that Persian influence made Jews more curious about what's going on in heaven. Now, astronomy, the interest in astronomy would have been there's a theory that in particularly scribes, it was kind of a scribal school which was almost like international, where scribes were interested in, there were certain types of scribes who were interested in astronomy, but you can be interested in astronomy without talking about angels. And in fact, the Astronomical Book of Enoch really does concentrate on the movements of the planets and to a lesser extent the stars, mainly the planets, mainly the sun and the moon, as opposed to talking about angels so much. So those are two different influences. Also, there's a theological kind of development where there's kind of a recognition in terms of where there's a rejection of this idea. I would say there's more of a rejection of this idea that a generation will suffer for the previous generation because the previous generation messed up because they sinned, or that a child will suffer because their parents sinned, right? And that is rejected. And then you need kind of, where is this all going to get evened out? Because I see that horrible person who's getting rewarded, and I see this really good person who's suffering terribly. Where does it all even out then? I know, and then they die, right? So I know that I saw them in their lifetimes. It didn't even out in their lifetimes the way it's supposed to. The way it says, for example, in Mishlei and Proverbs, everything's supposed to even out, everything's supposed to be fine. And then you see it doesn't. So where is it all going to even out? Well, there has to be some kind of judgment day or something where this all is going to work out. And then a little later, we get this idea of actual reward and punishment happening before a judgment day, right? In this heavenly sphere. And that's it's almost a natural progression. Once we're interested in the heavenly sphere, once we populate the heavenly sphere, then things can happen there to even things out, right? But that's not automatic, right? First, it's a judgment day where things are just kind of waiting for the judgment day, and then things get evened out. Now I'd like to go back a little bit to some questions that came up in the last class, and I'd like to address them. So first of all, I mentioned that Book of the Watchers as part of First Enoch, which is a good say about a third of the Book of Enoch actually survived in Greek. When are those Greek manuscripts dated to? It's essentially three manuscripts dated to the 4th to 6th century CE, so fairly late. And also the chronography of George Synkelus, and that's from the 9th century, but he's using 4th century texts. So the Greek manuscripts are considered important, but they're not super early copies. I mean, they're earlier than most of the Ethiopic copies we're going to have, right? So they're still pretty important. And normally we would look at the Greek, right, and prefer the Greek over the Ethiopic for particular parts of the Book of the Watchers. Also, I wanted to take a second to say something about the second and third books of Enoch, because I was just kind of hinting to them before. So there's something called the second book of Enoch. It's also called the Slavonic Enoch. It survived in Old Bulgarian medieval copies, 14th to 18th century. So medieval to much later. The Bulgarian is considered to be a translation of the Greek. Second Enoch is thought by many to be a Christian work and not a Jewish work, even though some do think that it's Jewish. It's not. But by many, it's considered to be a first century Christian work. Then we have third Enoch. Third Enoch is the rabbinic Enoch. It's the Hebrew Enoch. It's considered kind of part of the Hechalot literature. While third Enoch places itself in the second century CE, it's probably 5th century CE. So it's quite late, and it is quite rabbinic. It does not really draw much on earlier. It's not like a continuation of First Enoch. It's not simply really an interpretation of First Enoch. It's something else. It's much more connected, to the Hechalot literature. Enoch becomes an angel, talks about the heavenly spheres. And because it's not Second Temple, no one considers it a Second Temple work. I'm not really talking about it in the context of this class.
Just when you say watchers, what would that be in Hebrew?
Irim. Irim or
okay.
Irim. And we do see the word
Irim or what?
Or Irim. In Aramaic, it would have a nun ending.
Oh.
And in Hebrew, it has a mem ending. And while we, in our tradition, like we, not with Dead Sea Scrolls, would only be familiar with it with the nun ending, referring to angels, right? We do find it in the Dead Sea Scrolls with the mem ending, right? Which would be in Hebrew, kind of the Hebrew. Now, again, it doesn't always refer to the Watchers when we see the word Irim. Sometimes it just means angels. And we can tell by context what it's referring to, right? But it's interesting that in the translations, they're always referred to as Watchers.
Why Watchers? Why
again,
Watchers?
Probably because they're translating Irim as those who are awake all the time, those who are always awake, right? Right? So that is the theory. Okay, it's the best what we've got, right? It's the best understanding we've got, because the translation as Watchers is pretty consistent. Okay, so let's get back to our book of Enoch. I'd like to kind of dive back actually into the astronomical book, because there are certain things I'd like to point out. We just did it very quickly last time, and I promise not to get too bogged down in dates of the moon and the sun, etc. But there are certain things I'd like to point out. Now, once again, I am using the Nicolsburg Vanderkam translation, just so you know, if you want to find it. Here we are. Okay, so I wanted to point out, since we're talking about biblical interpretation. All right, so here, right above the law of the phases of the moon, here, I'm going to read, this is the law and course of the sun. We're in the astronomical book. This is the law and course of the sun. Its return when it returns 60 times and emerges. It is the great luminary, which is called the sun forever. This one that emerges is the great luminary, and it is named after its appearance as the Lord commanded. In this way, it emerges, and so it enters. It neither decreases nor rests, but runs day and night. Its light is 7 times brighter than that of the moon, but the size of the two is equal. So why is this important that it say to us something, of course, that is clearly not true also, but its light is 7 times brighter than that of the moon, but the size of the two is equal. And of course, there is a clear reason in biblical interpretation to do that, because we have a verse in Breshit, Aleph, Tet Zayin, that's Genesis 1:16. Vayas Elohim et shnei ha'me'orot ha'gedolim et ha'me'or ha'gedol l'mishal hayom vet ha'me'or ha'katon l'mishal halayla vet kochavim et ha'kochavim. God made the two great lights, the greater light to dominate the day, and the lesser light to dominate the night and the stars. So here he made the two great lights, but then one is bigger and one is smaller, creating an interpretive problem. And so the author of this section of Enoch solves this by saying and he's very clear, this one that emerges is the greater luminary, because the sun is called the bigger light, and it is named after its appearance as the Lord commanded, right? But its light is 7 times brighter than that of the moon, but the size of the two is equal. That's how they can both be called the two great lights and then be distinguished, and one is greater than the other. Okay, so that's kind of yes.
Is the original term for 7 times larger, 7 times brighter, Shiva time, or something related to Shiva time?
I don't think so. This was anyway. In general, Enoch is considered to be. It was originally in Aramaic, so I think the meaning was 7 times works nicely. I'm not sure if this is based on anything in particular, but probably just kind of a programmatic number. And it
because 7 is very often used just to mean many times greater.
And I think that you don't have to say that the word is Shiva time to say that, right?
Miriam, it's worth noting that when we look at the sky, the sun and the moon appear to us to be the same size.
Yes.
So that's the reason they compared them, because they look the same, because they didn't even know that they
so much farther away. But honestly, in this period, I mean, probably not the person who's writing this, but there was a lot of astronomical knowledge at this time, right? There was a lot of astronomical knowledge, and I'm not sure that someone who like a scribe who knew his stuff would really think that these planets are the same size.
They knew their size. They knew their distance.
They knew they wouldn't have known exactly. They wouldn't have known like us. But I don't. I mean, you could. I mean, you could say, well, there's a, you can have like. I can see how someone could say that. I certainly how this guy could say it. I do think that there's an interpretive reason for him to say this now, and I do think that probably in this period people knew that they weren't the same size. At any rate, so let's continue on. So and there's a certain inconsistency in the way this writer is describing months. Sometimes he describes them as sometimes he describes a 360-day year. Sometimes he describes a 364-day year. So, for example, here each month its emergence and setting change, and its days are like the days of the sun. In other words, the lunar month is the length of a solar month, which is 30 days, which doesn't work. In other places, he talks about a 364-day year. Here in, just to show this here in this footnote, we see a fragment from Qumran. I noted this last time. This is the way the Qumran section reads. It is quite different from the Aramaic copy. And here you have it, as the Aramaic copies show, he was severely abbreviating a lengthier table, right? It was longer, and then someone kind of shortened it, right? Abridged it. So if we go here, let me just scroll ahead here. In these verses, verse 10 to verse 16, you see he's doing a lot of math. In 3 years, there are 1,092 days. In 5 years, there are 1,820 days, resulted in 8 years, there are 2,912. Eventually, he gives up. I'm actually going to read you my footnote on this, because I certainly don't remember it by heart here. These confusing and somewhat redundant calculations reflect the start of an attempt to apply an 8-year cycle, an octatorus. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. This attempt motivates the comparison of the lunar and solar calendars for 3, 5, and 8 years. You can see in 3 years there are 1,092 days. You can see that in verse 13. In an 8-year cycle, 2 months of 30 days each are inserted after 5 years, and another such month is inserted after 3 years. so that in 8 years, the lunar and solar calendar cycles are synchronized. The 8-year cycle can be successfully applied when the lunar month alternates between 29 and 30 days, like in the Jewish calendar, right? And the solar year is understood to be 365 and 1/4 days, which is the Julian. However, since in the astronomical book, solar years are exactly 364 days compared to lunar years of 354 days, the difference between solar and lunar years cannot be resolved in this manner, and the author eventually abandons his calculations. In other words, he's doing calculations because he knows that there's some kind of way to resolve it in an 8-year cycle. The problem is he didn't do that with the lunar months and have them alternate between 29 and 30 days, so he ends up giving up. He does the calculations and then he gives up at the end of the chapter. That is why the astronomical book is particularly frustrating. So it's essentially the guy's kind of writing about he wants you to keep a 364-day calendar, but he really doesn't know how it's going to work. He doesn't know how it works out, right? Okay, so that's so that's what I wanted to kind of go into in the astronomical book. I'm going to pause for questions in case there are any. Are there any questions? Yes.
Just in general, going to school over the years, there was this idea, it wasn't always stated explicitly, but that the Jewish calendar was very scientific. One teacher used the word halacha l'Moshe Sinai.
Well, you just heard what I was just reading in the footnote is the 8 year the commentary that 8-year cycle, the 8-year cycle, what this guy's trying to do works for our calendar because the lunar month alternates between 29 and 30 days, and it works when you add the months at certain points, and then it works with a real solar calendar, right? Which is 365 and a quarter. Like, so it works if you do it the way we do it, right? This guy is thinking in terms of a solar year. Now, also you can just abandon the lunar calendar, right? And just do a solar. Yeah, we can't do that because we have lunar months that need to be adjusted to the solar season.
No, I was just commenting that there was a lot of pride. You know, they would talk about the Greeks and Greek astronomy, sometimes references. And then also they would talk about the Muslim calendar and, you know, how it was always behind in contrast to
the Muslim calendar there's no such thing as it being, as far as I know, there's no such thing as the Muslim calendar being behind, because it's a lunar calendar. So
exactly.
Ramadan can come out any time of the year. So it's never behind because it doesn't matter when the solar year is.
But the Jewish calendar, the Hebrew calendar was mamish perfect. And I'm not making fun of it. I'm just saying
that's the point. I mean, it's the same sentiment as what is behind these sort of astronomical determinations in the Second Temple period, right? Where our calendar must be perfect. If the calendar isn't perfect, that means that it can't be the divine calendar. What is the perfect calendar? That must be the original one. And that's why there's a real movement in this period that the solar calendar is the correct one, because they think that it's perfect. They don't know that the solar calendar needs a leap year. They don't know the solar calendar isn't exactly 364 days. They're like, this thing's perfect. It divides. Oh, it's perfect, right? And so that's what they are saying they should do. You have a 30-day month. You add 1 day a quarter, and that's what Dead Sea Scrolls also has. 30-day months. You add a day per quarter outside of the months, and you get to a 364-day year. It divides by 7, so you can determine the day of the week. So in the Dead Sea Scrolls, they make sure that you're never bringing a festival sacrifice on the day of Shabbat, right? A festival, a Chag, never falls out on Shabbat. Rosh Hashanah, the beginning of the year, is always Wednesday. Why? Because on Wednesday, planets were created. Now, this is us interpreting, right? They don't say that. But that's the day the planets were created, so that's when the year is going to start. We have that problem that you're supposed to count the Omer Mimacharat Shabbat, right, from the day after Shabbat. So we say, oh, it's the day after Yom Tov. They don't have to do that. They can set the day of the week so it actually is counted from Sunday, right? From Motzei Shabbat, I should say. So they can do all sorts of things. The problem is that the calendar doesn't work, right? If they kept that calendar for 100 years, they couldn't possibly, it wasn't lining up with the solar year. Right? It wasn't lining up. The holidays were not lining up because they weren't doing a leap year. They weren't doing a solar leap year. So one assumes that every now and then. In fact, let's take a look. Let's go back into our text and I'll show you something that some people have interpreted. It's probably not, to be perfectly honest. But there's a verse that some people have interpreted to say, oh, they were trying to deal with the leap years. So I'll show you that in just a second. Moshe Matitya says, oh, here, Susan also said, okay. Susan asked, does Second Temple literature discuss any of the angels in the Bible? Sure it does. Moshe says, the verse that says, it never decreases nor rests, but runs day and night. This sounds like it is addressing the dispute in the Talmud Bavli, in the Babylonian Talmud, Psachim 94b, about what the sun does during the night. Sages of Israel said that it travels over the opaque firmament and then stops at the eastern window and stays there at rest until morning. And the sages of the nation said that it steadily runs overnight through the underground water, only arriving at the eastern window by morning. And the Book of Enoch seems to be taking the latter position. Yeah, it's that way of talking about planets in terms of coming through and going through gates and going through windows. You can tell that this is not my fun place, right? This is not where I enjoy kind of sitting and learning. But yes, this is something that this is something that is absolutely a matter of discussion. And it's pretty clear that the sages also are drawing from astronomical traditions that are being shared, particularly in that area, right? In the Sasanian area. Again, there's a lot of Persian, Babylonian. There's a lot of scribal activity around astronomy.
Miriam,
yes.
It's at the time of the Talmud, which is 4th, 5th century AD. Yeah. They thought the sun was going, under places, stuff like that. Why would you think that 700 years earlier, the time of Hanoch, they would know what's the distance to the sun and the moon?
You're right. I'm not saying he knew the distance. I don't know that he knew the distance. I just because there's a lot of tracking of astronomical movements in kind of Babylonian scribal tradition, not later, or even earlier, very early Babylonian scribal tradition. There's a lot of tracking of astronomical movements. Honestly, I'm not 100% sure. Like I'm not. I wouldn't say, like, if you said to me, I can show you they thought they were the same size, I'd be like, okay, then that's what they thought. But I think that because they tracked astronomical movements so closely, that there was, at least to a certain extent, an understanding. But you could it's absolutely right, especially if they're talking about things going through gates and going out other gates and stuff like that. If they're really talking about it that way, then things are going to be fairly similar sized, right? If that's how they see the heavens. Okay, so now I'm going to share my screen again. We're going to go back to, okay. All right. I wanted to show you, all right, the change of the year. So here, I'm reading from, it should be here, yes. So at the end, this is considered a later interpolation, right? Because after the astronomical book, you have this summary and a prediction of human sin, that because of sin, the calendar is going to get all messed up. So if we take a look, it actually says, in the days of the sinners, the rainy seasons will grow shorter, their seed will become late on their land and their fields. Everything on the earth will change. Dun, 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 dun. The moon will change its order and will not appear at its normal time. At that time, it will be on the sky. In other words, the movement of the moon is going to be wrong. Things will be wrong. So that's some people say, well, this is an explanation of why we did the calendar and now it's messed up, right? We need a leap year. It's not matching up. It's because of sinners. At the same time, if you look here, it's talking about the rainy seasons. It's talking about how all the seasons are going to get messed up completely. So it's hard to say that it's just the calendar. They're talking about a really kind of, not almost apocalypse, like a change of the seasons because of sinners, more than that. But it is connected to this idea that astronomically things are not going the way they should go. Many heads of the stars will stray from the command and will change the command, like the order, right? And will change their ways and actions and will not appear at the times prescribed for them. So it does sound like the calendar is going to get messed up. Is it something where someone at this time is saying, you know what, the rain didn't come at the right time, and are the season and the calendar that we've been keeping, it's not matching up with the seasons, right? Are they saying, you know, is that what's going on, or is it really more like in the future and seeing something more apocalyptic? That is a question.
There are
Yes.
known accounts of climate change in those years. So
well, there's always, you can always have a year where things are not right, you know, and you can say, oh, this is it. Like they could be writing it that year, right? Look, this is it. The year's not right, and also our calendar isn't lining up, and that's what we're talking about. Here, if we talk about, you know, right and wrong calendrical practice, these titles are the titles of the translators. They're not titles in the book. Okay. So here we have here people. This is talking about specifically you need to have a 364-day calendar and not a 360-day calendar. Right. So it's blessed are all the righteous, et cetera, et cetera. The sun travels in the sky, entering and emerging for 30 days with the heads of thousands in the order of the stars, with the 4 additional ones that divide between the 4 parts of the year. You need the extra 4 days. You need 360 plus 4 extra days. People err regarding them and do not calculate them in the numbering of the entire year because they err regarding them. And people do not understand them precisely. For they belong in the reckoning of the year, right, et cetera, et cetera. Thus, a year of 364 days is completed, right? This is a specifically saying you need a 364-day year, not a 360-day year. Don't make a mistake. So you can see one of the things this tells us is that this is a real argument at this time. They're really arguing about calendars and the specific things, like exactly how long it needs to be, et cetera. Now, I will repeat what I've said before. The entire area, this entire area of the world, except for Egypt, like, and by entire, I mean, the Near East kept a lunisolar calendar. They kept a lunar calendar that was adjusted for the solar year. That's what everyone did. They certainly did in Persia. They did Babylonia. That's why, again, we could simply take the Babylonian names for months and just smack them right on our months, which were simply numbered: first month, second month, third month, and we could take these names from the Babylonian month names and just put them on there because they all matched up. When the Greeks conquered this area, they started to compare things and they said the Egyptian solar year is perfect. It's better. And then when the Judeans found out about this, many of them said, oh, it is perfect. It is better. This must be the right one. Someone made a mistake. Right. So that is the argument, the classic argument, possibly between the Stokim and the Prushim, right? Where what calendar are we keeping? Are we keeping a solar calendar? Are we keeping a lunisolar calendar, right? Again, the reason to keep a solar calendar is because our holidays are so connected to the agricultural cycle. You cannot have our holidays with them not being, you can't do it the way the Muslims do Ramadan. Pesach can't move to any part of the year. It must be in the spring. Our holidays are connected to agricultural seasons, and therefore they must be connected to the solar year. And yet we've always kept lunar months. So the argument was, oh, there must have been a mistake. You're not supposed to do the lunar months. You're supposed to do solar months, etc.
How far back does the attachment of the zodiac to the Hebrew months go back?
The zodiac. I mean, we just start seeing the zodiac in like synagogues and like after like what was it, like third, fourth century CE, right? That's where you start seeing it. I don't think we see it. I mean, I don't think we see it earlier than that. And people can correct me if you see. We don't have it on coins or anything like that. So that wouldn't be super. That wouldn't be crazy early. It would be, and there's also, but it's very interesting because there's a whole theory about why these things were with the sun chariot in the middle were popular in synagogues. There's a theory about it, which I forgot. As one of you will probably remember it. There's actually a whole theory about why would we see this as a theme in synagogue floors, which is during this period.
You mean the Greek god Helios?
Yeah, the Greek Helios, right? Like why? And there's an idea that it's actually making a statement of some kind. But I to be perfectly honest, I've forgotten what the statement was. It's been a while. Usually I remember these things, but this time it just flew out of my head. Okay, so moving right along, let us move to, if there are no more questions or comments, let's continue on. Back to our book.
Second, did you say that the Pharisees and the Sadducees were discussing a solar calendar?
Well, classically, they say that the Sadducees were pro solar. It's not. This is the big argument. This is the big argument, okay? Or the Stoics rather were for a solar calendar, or the Baitosim. You know, there's an idea, and it's interesting because the big question is, well, how can anyone serve in the temple if they don't agree with the calendar, right? Yeah. So that would be the argument that no, how they couldn't, because if they're in the temple, they can possibly agree with the calendar. I mean, we know that the Dead Sea sect kept a different calendar in their own stories, right, where they're talking about the wicked priest who comes and tries to make them eat on Yom Kippur. Why? Because it's not the right Yom Kippur, right? But it's interesting because there's an article. Ask me for it afterwards. I think I can find it and send it to you. That argues based on that you didn't have to split because of the calendar. And in we have in the Cairo Geniza, we have ketubot, marriage contracts between Karaites and Rabbinites, where they come to a compromise in terms of holidays, where the thing is she will keep her holidays and he will keep his holidays, and they're not going to bother each other. And I don't remember if they said I don't think they said what the kids were going to do, but like there's like, it was part of the marriage agreement, like each one of them will respect the other one's holiday dates. And if you can do that, right, then in theory you can find a way, but it's a little bit harder in the temple because there are sacrifices connected to it. So that's a big question of to what extent was this calendar argument taken seriously. And that's my advisor Larry Schiffman, that was why he argued that the Qumran sect were actually Tzdokim, who were actually religious, who actually believed in it. And they were like, we can't stay connected to the temple if you guys aren't going to keep the right holidays. We can't be priests in that temple anymore because, we actually believe in this. Whereas the other ones were just like, hey, they weren't really from Stoic. They didn't have the courage of their convictions. Yes.
But Qumran notwithstanding, I think there is evidence of fights breaking out over when to celebrate Yom Kippur and well,
we have in the Gemara, we have in the Talmud a classic argument, right, where they actually expel someone because where a sage is humiliated by being forced to break what he has calculated as Yom Kippur, right? And because it was considered done so poorly, the Nasi is actually brought down for a short time, right? Because it's considered like this really wasn't necessary. You didn't have to go that far. And the idea is we cannot have that sort of argument. That sort of argument cannot stand. We cannot allow someone to sit there and say, you're keeping the wrong Yom Kippur. We have decided that this is Yom Kippur, and he has to show that he will do it. He will act according to what we've said. So it's these calculations, these calendrical calculations were super important. They were always super important because you have to, because there's so much that depends on it. If I say Yom Kippur is a different day, and then you can't, then I think you guys are all sinning. Everyone is a sinner, and there's going to be a big, big, big split. And the question is, how is that the reason for splits? This article, what is it called? I think, But for the Law, the Sect Will Split, I think is the name of the article. And it's arguing that whenever there is an actual split, it's generally not about actual specific laws. It's about an approach. And that there's an approach that leads to split. So, for example, when I was a kid, I always learned the Reform movement split off because of the second Yom Purkan, right? They didn't want to say the second Yom Purkan, and that's why they split off, right? And the actual, and then, you say, well, they split off because because they wanted to say the sermon in the synagogue in German. It's like, really? That's why you split off? Because that's you wanted to say the sermon in the synagogue in German? And no, because they were splitting off because there was an idea behind it. There was an idea that was part of the basic idea. We want to be like everyone else. We don't want to say this in Hebrew anymore or in Yiddish, right? We want to be like the non-Jews in this. And that approach was what caused the split. And they hung it on this little argument about something that you're doing, right? Where it was the approach. And there's an idea in terms of the approach, for example, at Qumran, not just the calendar, but also what takes precedence, for example, in terms of the temple. Is it purity or is it letting everyone in, right? The thing that I always quote is what I always quote is that at Qumran, they're like, how can you let in blind people and deaf people into the temple precincts? They clearly don't know purity law. The blind person can't read it. The deaf person can't hear it. They can't possibly be keeping purity law the way they're supposed to in order to get to the temple. How can you let them in, right? Now that is legal. That's a legal argument, but it's reflecting a certain idea of what's more important here. What's more important, to let blind and deaf people into the temple precinct or to keep the darn purity laws, right? And Qumran's coming down, the Qumran community is coming down very clearly on one side of that equation. So that's the question is the calendar the only thing they're explaining? There's an argument here, and in fact, when you read these texts, the calendar is embedded in a lot of different things that are going on. When you're making this, when Enoch, you've got this whole idea about the calendar, but also this idea that what's going on in heaven with the angels, this is super important. Like, and this idea of knowing what's going to happen in the future, and there's going to be some big judgment day, and this is something that we should be really thinking about. This is something that's going to really involve us. And that whole emphasis is something that also is all being kind of put together. Now, that's taking what I just did was a certain leap. Like, you don't have to say that they're all from, in fact, the Astronomical Book was written separately, right? It was written separately and put in this book. Why? Because it has to do with Enoch. As I said before, the Book of Enoch is a collection of books of Enoch. It's a collection of books of Enoch with frequently not much in common. And the main thing they have in common is that they are all about Enoch, quote unquote, right?
Doesn't it appear in general that the dating of the Chagim in Jerusalem depended on whether it was the Stukim or the Prushim who were in control of the Bet HaMikdash at any given time?
I mean, sure. I mean, like, whatever was going on in the Bet HaMikdash would be determined by whoever was in control, right? But the Prushim seem to have had a pretty good, pretty firm control over it from the Hasmoneans on, right? So that would already, that's when you get the argument, right? Whoever's in control kind of is doing stuff. Like, what were they doing before the Hasmoneans? I certainly don't know. And so Susan says the problem with the solar calendar and the Chagim would have been apparent very quickly. Why would the idea be subscribed to long enough to be written up in Enoch or any Jewish book? And again, I've mentioned this before, but the Qumran community, at least according to their own dates, they seem to have been around for about 100 years at least. And in 100 years, if you're trying to keep a 364-day calendar, you're going to realize that you're off by quite a bit, right? And the question is, so what did they do? Did they not keep the calendar, or did they keep the calendar? And probably the most convincing answer is they kept the calendar. And then every now and then they're like, oh, someone messed up. Someone messed up. We need to adjust it, right? Now, again, it could be that people pointed to verses like this saying in the days of the sinners, the calendar is going to get messed up. That moon's not going to be in the right cycle and things are going to get messed up. And it could be that they pointed to that and said, that's what's going on. Or it could be they said someone messed up, but we still have a perfect calendar. Because again, they were keeping a 364-day calendar, which is close. But for 100 years, you can't do that. I mean, that's not going to work. So maybe were they keeping the calendar for the entire time? Who knows? But there are people who say they never kept the calendar. There are some people say this was an ideal calendar and they weren't keeping it, right? Or not keeping it in the way it's written. but it's also possible that they were simply they simply adjusted when they needed to, and laid up to someone that someone had made a mistake. Okay, on with Enoch. Oh my goodness, it's almost the end of the hour. Okay, wow, this happens, huh? So okay, I will say that
the fault is with your audience.
What?
The fault is with your audience.
I feel bad, guys. I don't mean to, like, but please do come back next week, because the next part of Enoch had some really fun stuff in it, because we're going to get to the animal apocalypse. The animal apocalypse is fun. The animal apocalypse is the retelling of the history of the world in animals. It's the retelling of the Genesis style history of the world in animals, where people, before there are different nations, people are cows and bulls. Jews then are sheep, and the different nations get to be different animals. And actually, by looking at what animals are assigned to who, we can actually see certain types of interpretation going on there as well. For those of you who know me, you know that it is in my commentary of the animal apocalypse, where I was censored. I made a only slightly off-color joke in my commentary, and they're like, "Oh, you sure you want to leave this in?" And I'm like, yeah, leave it in. And they took it out. I mean, it really is not a big deal. But like when we get to it next week, I'll tell you. And then depending on the reaction, I'll either cut it from the recording or not. Oh, before we finish, let me just stay with me for 1 second. Do I still have everyone? Just a moment, because I do want to let's see if I can find it now. Oh no, but here here I will note, so it's in the dream visions. That's what we're going to be doing next. And for many of these books, there is an explanation of how it got to how Enoch was able to pass the book on, right? So here in Enoch's first dream vision, and now my son Methuselah, I will show you all the visions that I saw, right? So the idea is, in many places in the book, there is some lip service given. Here we have it. Here in the Astronomical Book, for example, here we have Enoch's instruction to Methuselah. Now, my son Methuselah, I am telling you all these things, and I'm writing them down. I have revealed all of them to you, and have given you the books about all these things. Okay, and that's how Enoch gets this kind of scribal image of him being a scribe, because he has to write these books in order to pass them down. How do we have these books if they're all about Enoch's visions of the future, and Enoch's astronomy, and Enoch's and seeing things in the angelic world? He has to give them to his son, write them down, so that they reach us eventually. And that's something that in the different parts of this book, which, remember, were different books, are frequently explained to us. This is how we got them. And we're going to see in our next class, at the end, there's it addresses the problem of, how do you believe these books, right? It doesn't really address the problem. It actually says you shouldn't believe other books. Those other books are fake, right? Those terrible people, they make up their own books. But there isn't actually an acknowledgement that this is something that is going on. People are writing books in their own words or in their own names, and it depending on what you're translating. So thank you for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you next week.